Hello, and welcome to this second clip about the ancient Greek poleis, and today more specifically about the several different forms of government that the Greek poleis had. And we'll start with this little painting. It's from the 19th century, and it's the famous painting where you see an Athenian statesman called Pericles who delivers his speech over a funeral in which he very specifically praises the Athenian democracy, which is the main topic for today. So, where were we last time? You might remember that we've been discussing several things and we sort of left off when we talked about the availability of agriculture in most Greek city-states, in most Greek poleis. And most cities had a shortage of farmland and therefore the problem of overpopulation. And one of the solutions was to emigrate, to start up colonies in other countries. And we sort of left off when we realized, or actually sort of identified, the most important problem, that there was this huge group of tradesmen who wanted to have more political influence. Well, in 509 BC, and that's a very important date, one Athenian statesman started up a new idea. There were several, but I think Clisthenes was the most important one who came up with the idea of giving the power to the people. And you could call this a democratic revolution if you want. What did it entail? It meant that, up until 509 BC, there was this small group of nobles ruling the city, and we call this oligarchy, which is rule of the few, and in most cases, one form of oligarchy is aristocracy, the rule of the few best, which are very often nobles, people who by birth have been given a certain amount of wealth or status and therefore call themselves nobles. And Athens was no different, so there was a group of nobles in charge. Another form is plutocracy, when it's rule of the rich, and you probably understand that very often these two forms are combined. Lots of other poleis had kings, such as Sparta and Thebes, for example. So all of them had different state forms, but Athens started a sort of revolution towards democracy. And as I mentioned, there were other people. So Solon was one, but most importantly Clisthenes, who imposed a set of laws, and they were all meant to constrain the power of the nobles. So they wanted to take the power away from this small group and give them to all people who had citizenship, who had the rights to be an Athenian citizen. So what they did, they installed an assembly, a public assembly. Every man with citizenship could take part in that assembly. It's a form of direct democracy. And on top of that, there was sort of a system of districts that would sort of convene, and a boule would be chosen, a group of 500, and those 500 people would be appointed yearly to entail and make decisions in the daily life of the Athenians. So they would deal with all the things that had to be done with. They were sort of the daily state of affairs. And this was a very revolutionary system. So why do we remember this? Why do we learn about democracy and Athens? Because it was the first Greek polis who imposed this system as a form of government. And still, if you compare it to our modern day society, it's very limited. So slaves were not allowed. They didn't have any citizenship. No women whatsoever, actually in public life whatsoever. Women had no say. So that was pretty, you could call it backward, but at least that was not the equality that you think of when you talk about democracy. Also foreigners, so people without any Athenian citizenship, they were all excluded from this democratic revolution. Well, what does it mean? There were several governmental organs in Athens, and you at least need to know a few of them. The ecclesia, as I mentioned, so all the Athenian citizens voting about taxes, laws, declaring war. The boule, the 500 citizens who would sort of deal with daily affairs. And apart from that, the magistrates, the people who ruled Athens politics, and the army, and they were also elected for 1 year. And these were all very honorary titles and very important jobs to have in Athens. Besides this, there was another system introduced, which is called the ostracism, very typically Greek, and it's called after the Greek word for ostrakon, which means a shirt of a pot. And the whole idea was that if there was a majority to have an ostracism, there would be sort of a selection, we would say. So everyone was invited to write down the name of an Athenian individual on a piece of one of those pots, so one of these shirts, an ostrakon in Greek. And if someone would get over a certain amount of votes, he would be disbanded, banished from the city for a period of time of 10 years. So they could, in this way, get rid of people who would threaten the democracy. This was a system that was used to get rid of people who were sort of, for example, saying that they wanted to take back power or disband the democracy, or and so on. Of course, you can imagine this was also a bit of a risk, so it could be abused, the system, to just get rid of anyone you didn't like, but a certain set of votes needed to be made for this whole banishment to take place. Most votes is banishment, the shirt of a pot, ostrakon. So the ostracism was a sort of democratic institution to help safeguard democracy. Well, when we continue our time, this idea of this democracy, it didn't really spark the Golden Age, but it coincided with the classical Greece Golden Age. And two things are important: the Persian Wars, of which we will talk a bit more later in later movie clips, but there was lots of economical growth. So this was the period of classical Greece, the time we know very much about because lots of it was written down. All these scientists, all the political systems, all the people doing all these modern inventions, thinking rationally about stuff, that's all the golden age of mostly Athens and not so much other city-states. This is also the period in which there's a war between Athens and Sparta, and the fact that Sparta wins in 404 BC also marks the end of the golden age for Athens, and 323 is the date where the Macedonian kings take over the entirety of the Greek Poleis. So these are sort of the boundaries of this era. However, as I mentioned, this is the golden time. We know so much about culture, architecture, philosophy because of the golden age and everything that has been written down. So these dates are actually quite important, so that you remember that this is actually only a period of, if you think of it very smallly, a period of maybe 60, 70 years in which all these inventions were done and all these famous people emerged. When we compare the system of Athens to Sparta, you see that Sparta was in effect an aristocracy. So there was a public assembly, but only nobles could propose a law. Most people who had power there would have very limited amounts of power. And the assembly only had sort of the rights to reject or accept a new law, but they could not vote on other stuff. They could not propose a new law themselves, so they were very limited in their power. Besides that, in Sparta, there were two kings who each would lead a half or part of the army. So there were kings, more monarchy. There was an aristocracy because the Spartans, the Spartiates, actually would have most power. And to conclude, each polis had a very different system, and it was very much based on traditions and customs. We'll get back to Sparta a bit later when we talk about their know-abouts. When we look at social structure, you see that in Sparta there was a hierarchy. So it was not the democracy of every man is equal as long as you have city rights. No, there was a very strict hierarchy. So you see here the Spartiates at the top, who were born into the family, who would own land, who were soldiers. So the strategy of Sparta of dealing with overpopulation was just conquering all other peoples in the area and just making them slaves and have them work for you. So the most important group existed out of mostly soldiers. Then you have the perioiki. In Greek that just means the people who live around. They would not own land, but they would work. They could be merchants. And all below were the helots. They would be born as slaves, would be oppressed, and they would actually have to do all the work. So you see, this is a very hierarchical system, and democracy was out of the question in this social structure in Sparta. Finally, when you look at public life, you see that much of the public life revolved around the agora, or the agora, whichever way you want to emphasize it, where all politics, commerce, and trade would be dealt with. So these were very large spaces in each poleis, sometimes within the Acropolis, sometimes around it. But all these public buildings were here, and unfortunately, most of the color has disappeared over the days. But some of these civilizations were very colorful. Even the columns were very colorful. So please, this is an example of the Minoan civilization. Please don't think that it was all boring white marble. Sometimes they would really take time to show them the wealth of the polis, because that was something you could be proud of. If you take a look at finally the social status of certain types of people in the poleis, you would see that there was a huge difference between men and women in all poleis, so not only in Athens or Sparta, but all of them. And it would be very typically, as well, history has been very typical stereotype when it comes to gender and men and women. The men would be leading a public life. They would go out, they would discuss, they would have political power, talk about politics, run the business, and would be responsible for the income. The woman, and if there were several, so daughters, it would be more than one woman. The women would be in charge of the family life. So they would be in private. They always had to be accompanied by men to go about outside. However, their private household was their domain. So they were in charge of everything there. And that very often included, of course, the slaves. So slavery was totally common. There were slaves everywhere in all Greek poleis, whether it was in the household, cleaning, doing cooking and so on, sometimes even teaching, or as you see on the other picture, working in the mines, which was very hard work. Slaves were everywhere. It was very common in all poleis, all societies, to have slaves, and they would be either born in slavery or they would be prisoners of war. Sometimes slave traders would actually start capturing people and just to sell them as slaves. But it was a huge economy, the trading of slaves, the market of slaves, all around the Mediterranean. So this was a very common thing. And Athens would have had up to tens of thousands of slaves at certain points of time, because they were so common. So this whole idea of democracy was only relevant for the people who would have a certain status as citizens. Still, for ancient times it was very new, so that's why you need to know about democracy. But please don't forget, it was always over the backs of hard-working people, which were leading a life in slavery. That's it for today. I hope you were able to answer the questions that are accompanied by this movie clip. And I'll see you next time for the next clip. Bye-bye.